All right. First off, I am Keaton Worland. I am not only an elder here, but I am also the youth leader. And just wanted to take a moment, though, to thank the other volunteers that show up each and every week at Wired. Jeremy, Kendall, and Allie, you guys are amazing, and the ministry and the work that God's doing in our ministry would not be the same without you guys. So I truly appreciate everything you guys do each week. And our youth are being blessed by them. They're being great role models and growing their relationships with Christ. So thank you guys immensely. Now, I have been given the opportunity to bring God's word this morning, and I am feeling incredibly blessed to do so. But I want to keep with the theme that we are highlighting Wired here this morning. And when we do that on a Wednesday night, what that looks like is that we go verse by verse through a book of the Bible, and then we'll ask some leading questions and have some dialogue back and forth, and then we will break into small groups and whatnot. Now, I'm not going to break you all up into small groups, but I do want to take the opportunity to walk through a passage this morning, verse by verse, being able to add context and ways that it applies to our lives, and hopefully find some takeaways that we can grow closer to Christ with this morning. And then you've all heard about the parent emails that we send out, so don't be surprised if you guys find an email in your inbox tomorrow with some questions. The reason why we do that is we don't want the messages or the things that are being taught here in the sanctuary to stay in the sanctuary. We want them to be lived out outside these walls on a regular basis. And so one way we can do that, at least with our Wired members, is have them discuss it with their families. And so I would like for you guys to probably see some of that as well. So let's go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 9. And we're going to be in verse 18 through 25 this morning. As you guys are turning there, it'll also be up on the screen. You may find yourself fairly familiar with this passage. And that's okay, because I truly believe that God is going to speak to us this morning in a very fresh way. All right, let's read God's word. Once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "God's Messiah." Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. And he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." Then he said to them all, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." Father, these are your words this morning, Lord. We know that they are true, and we ask that you let your truth permeate our hearts this morning. Allow it to change us, challenge us, and Lord, ultimately, let us respond to it this morning. Father, we invite you here this morning in your name. Amen. 24.3 points per game, 10.0 rebounds per game, and 6.3 assists per game. Those are the career stats of the greatest basketball player to ever come out of the state of Indiana. And he's also one of the greatest basketball players in the NBA's history. It's Larry Bird, right? Larry Bird. When I can remember growing up being just so infatuated and enamored with who Larry Bird was, watching him on the replays of his game film, and just studying how he played the game. Everything about the way that he moved, to understanding it, was just amazing to me. I truly wanted to be more like, not Mike, but Larry at that moment, right? He was my hero. And then back in 2005, I had an opportunity, an unexpected opportunity, while I was at a Pacers game, to meet the Larry Bird. I could see him. I knew he was there. I saw him up on a jumbotron. I was staring at him, thinking like, man, I wish I could be over there by him, getting his autograph like everybody else. And I realized I could, right? All I had to do was respond. I had to do something. But the problem was, at this time, I only had 3 minutes left to get over there. I spent the last 17 minutes staring up at the jumbotron, wishing it was me. But once I finally kind of got out of being starstruck, I responded, and I took off to the other side of the arena. I ran past some security guards. I hurdled over a couple rows of seats. I maybe, sort of, kind of, ran over a grandma to get a better pursuit angle down the stairs. She was okay, I promise. But in that moment, nothing was going to stop me. Nothing was going to change my path, because I was going to get to Larry Bird, because that's who he was to me in that moment. And you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with what we just read in Luke? Well, an identity drives a response. You see, my response to Larry Bird and running over the grandma was rooted in who he was to me and what he meant to me in that moment. If that would have been a team owner or just an unknown college player, my response would not have been the same. I maybe wouldn't have acted at all. So, likewise, when we come to know who Jesus is and encounter him and rightly understand who he is, and that he's God himself, Lord over all, this too is going to drive a response in us. And that response is going to be to lay down everything we have and to go follow him. His identity demands our response because his identity holds a purpose. And now, before we jump into the text, I think it's important to understand where Luke 9 comes to us in the Gospel of Luke. So, Luke, in the first 8 chapters, the first 8 chapters, he takes this time to illustrate who Jesus is. He paints this picture of Jesus and his ministry. He is showing us that he is his true identity here. And then he does this by looking at his miracles, the different teachings that he has and performs, and then also by looking at the confrontations that he had with various political and religious leaders of that time. And then even on multiple occasions, we hear that the crowds are starting to ask, who is this guy? Who is it that the winds even obey him? Or who is he that he can forgive sin? Who is he? And Luke is doing this all for one singular reason. And that reason is to answer the question that we read in our text this morning. Who do you say that I am? And then from there, on the other side of our text, Luke uses Jesus' life and the way that he walked it out as the prime example of what we are to do with that information as Christians and as his disciples. So, our big summary point that I want you to see emerge as we walk through these 8 verses this morning. Jesus is the Messiah, and so we need to live like it. So, remember, Jesus' reputation is building, right? It is spreading like a wildfire across the region. People are talking, and they're talking so much that now the Roman authorities are starting to catch wind of it, and they're questioning who Jesus is. Even Herod at this time is becoming intrigued. He wants to know more about Jesus. And it's becoming evident to just the ordinary folk, the everyday person, that Jesus is not just an ordinary man. He's something or someone else. Someone important. Someone with great influence. And because of the crowds were hearing this and feeling this, the crowds were growing, right? The crowds, more and more people were coming to see Jesus. And you might even say that at that moment they were living with a little bit of FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. They didn't want to miss what the commotion was about. And so, as we enter into our text this morning, we see them begin to speculate about Jesus' identity. Verse 18, it reads, "Once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, 'Who do the crowds say I am?'" Now, here, Jesus doesn't need the disciples to pump him up or to tell him all the great things that people may be saying about him. Jesus is doing this for a different reason, right? He is doing this to start to make a point to the disciples about why the masses may be coming to him. So what do they say? Verse 19, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life. Why these identities? Why did the crowds believe that Jesus could be one of these three camps? Well, at that time, many of the people, they had known of John the Baptist, they had heard of him, but very few of them had actually come across him in their life. So they didn't know what he looked like. They didn't know if Jesus was or was not John the Baptist. They purely knew his reputation. And based off of that and the works that Jesus had been doing, they logically concluded that maybe this is John the Baptist. But Herod knew that couldn't be the case, right? Because, not too long before this, he had John the Baptist killed, and so that couldn't be Jesus' identity. So others said Elijah. It could be Elijah, right? And that's rooted in the idea that in Malachi 4 that Elijah will return in the day of the Lord. And so they're like, well, Jesus is doing these spectacular things. He's healing people. He's teaching with great wisdom. So maybe this is Elijah. But that was wrong too. And then there was the idea that Jesus was a great prophet. I mean, Jesus presented himself like he, kind of embodied the scriptures. He had such a great wisdom and depth and just true understanding of the scriptures that they said, surely this guy has to come from a long line of prophets because of how he is teaching. But at the end of the day, what Jesus is trying to show them is that the crowds are not coming to see Jesus for his true identity, but they're just coming for some other potential reason, something that sparked their interest. It wasn't because they knew that he was the Messiah yet. And so I turn that back to today. What do our crowds say? Would it be any different? Does our culture know who Jesus really is? I think three camps really exist in our crowds today. The first one is going to be the one that holds on to that idea that Jesus is a great prophet. And that's going to be rooted in the idea that are from those that are outside of the Christian faith. People that recognize Jesus as somebody that was a great teacher and had a lot of wisdom, but he wasn't on the same level as God. That's camp one. And then there's another camp that says that, well, he wasn't even a prophet. He was just a great person who was a great teacher. And he also had this really amazing moral gauge, one that I think that I should probably model myself after. He can be my role model. I want to follow this kind of Jesus because that Jesus is good. And being good in today's culture seems to be good enough. And then there are still others who believe that Christians just made him up. Jesus is just a figment of our imagination, this guy that we've created, that to add value and purpose and direction to our life. But it's these kind of identities that are skewing our cultural view of who Jesus is. A recent Barna study actually found that while 92% of all people believe that Jesus walked this earth, that he was real, fewer and fewer of them are believing that Jesus was also fully God. And in that fact, we actually found a trend, and that trend said that the younger you are, the less you believe that Jesus is God. And on top of all that, 35% of all people, irregardless of age, race, time and place, that Jesus was a sinner like you and I. That's what our culture is believing. And we can continue with these stats, but I don't think there's a point to, because if we have a significant portion of our population already believing that Jesus is just a great teacher or a great prophet, like that we should go to when we're having a bad day or struggling, like we do our favorite podcast, we have a problem. And if each new generation to come now and as we go is believing less and less in the holiness of Jesus, then we're in trouble. But God is sovereign. He is faithful, and he has a plan. He had a plan for the crowds back then, and he also has a plan for our crowds today. And that plan involves us. But what our role will look like in that plan is going to hinge on how we responded to Jesus' next question. In verse 20, talking to his disciples and by proxy to us, he says, "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" West Springs, this is the most important question that we will ever be asked, and the most important question that we will ever have to answer for ourselves. Peter responds, "God's Messiah." Now, something you have to understand about Peter is during their walk with Christ, that he would often be the spokesman for the disciples. We see this kind of show up throughout the scriptures, and right here, I can only imagine that as Peter says this, he's staring Jesus in the face, he's staring God himself in the face, and he says, "Jesus, you are not John the Baptist, you are not Elijah, and you are not merely a prophet." But he says, "Jesus, you are the Messiah, you are the anointed one, you are God's divine deliverer, the one sent from heaven to earth to redeem all of creation. That is who you are." And he was right. But I don't want you to think that Peter came to this conclusion on his just own well-being, right? He didn't have some sort of superpower to decode this situation. Peter is just like you and I. He was just another human, but God was at work and he had a plan, and he was using Peter in this moment. Jesus even tells him that in the parallel passage in Matthew 16:17. He says, "For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." So, God was at work, his plan was in motion, and he was beginning at this moment to reveal to the disciples Jesus' true identity. Why? So that they could be encouraged to continue their walk with Christ, because it's going to get tough. But then he also wanted them to be inspired to go and share the good news with the masses, with the crowds, the ones who didn't know his true identity. But this put the disciples in a very interesting position, really, because they knew God's Messiah was coming to not just come, but he was coming to conquer and he was coming to reign. However, they didn't understand the how. They didn't know how Jesus was going to get to his rightful eternal throne. So they start creating all of these ideas in their head. You know, they're probably thinking, well, maybe we'll walk alongside Jesus and we will conquer every kingdom alongside of him, hip to hip. Or, you know what, maybe better yet, we'll create a political uproar and we'll let them take themselves down. That'd be good, right? They had no clue. But they weren't certain about that, but they were certain that they were ready to go and share it, who Jesus was. Which is why what Jesus says next in this passage that we're looking at this morning catches them so off guard. So right after learning and confessing Jesus' true identity, Jesus tells them in verse 21, Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. Why? Verse 22, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." This was not what the disciples were expecting to hear at all. Why would the Messiah, the chosen one, come to earth to suffer, die, and be raised again? That didn't make sense. And quite frankly, they didn't believe it. So much so that Peter rebukes Jesus right after he confesses him as Messiah. If we look at Mark's account of this passage in chapter 8, verses 32 and 33, it says, he, being Jesus, spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely the human concerns. In other words, everything that the disciples at that time had been trying to formulate in their heads was coming from a self-serving origin. They were putting their desires, their wills, their wants ahead of God's will because they wanted to reign today with him. They didn't understand what Jesus was saying. But Jesus knew what was to come because he knew the purpose behind his life, right? He knew that he had to fulfill the prophecy that was already said. So in Isaiah 53, 3 through 5, the prophet Isaiah said it like this. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. So you see, Jesus had to share this with the disciples of how he was going to get to his throne because he needed the disciples to understand that his identity as God's Messiah had a purpose greater than they could have ever imagined. And that pathway to the throne that they wanted to be right alongside with conquering was going to look different. And how they were going to be participating was going to look different as well. So, what are the disciples supposed to do with this kind of information? How are they supposed to respond? What are we supposed to do with this kind of information? And how are we to respond today? Verses 23 through 25 gives us some insights. Then he said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? What's Jesus getting at here in these verses? What is he telling us about being his disciple, responding to his true identity? Jesus is saying, now that you know exactly who I am, God's Messiah, it's time to look in the mirror. It's time to look in the mirror and see how are we going to respond in our culture today. How are we going to live out being his disciples? And Jesus gives us 3 clear responses that we should turn to. We have to deny oneself, we have to pick up our cross, and then we have to follow him. Now, like Jesus, this is a highly countercultural call for our lives, right? Because today's society, what does it teach us? It says, I'm important, right? I'm more important than you. My needs, my wants, me. But Jesus is saying, the self needs to die, right? You cannot be more important. Your desires cannot be ahead of mine and my Father's. And sometimes I think that we can really struggle with this. I mean, we get it in theory, right? We understand what it means to die to oneself in theory. But it can be really hard to live out. Really hard. And often our Christian response is just, let's be a little more Christian. We'll just add on a little more Jesus. So we double down on devotional time. We jump into another small group. We increase our tithe. Now, don't get me wrong. All of these things are incredibly important, and I hope and pray that each and every one of us are involved in these behaviors, because we should be. But in this passage, Jesus is not calling us to add him on more, is he? He's telling us we need to look inward. We need to look at that internal self and respond that way. We need to look at the area that our desires, our aspirations, the actual intentions behind our actions, where they originate. That is the self we have to turn to. That is the self that must die in this moment for Jesus. And why? Because we are inherently selfish beings. At our very core, before we come to know Christ, every single action we do is for self-promotion. It is to put ourselves ahead of somebody else before we know Christ. But when we come to know Christ, when we come to answer Jesus' question like Peter did, as Jesus is God's Messiah, we cannot live that way. We have to live for Jesus only and completely. And Paul says it really well. I love how he says it in Galatians. In Galatians 5, 16 and 17, it says, "Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." So then how do we do it? Where do we go? After we have announced Jesus as God's Messiah, the one that is going to reign eternal, how do we pick up our cross daily? How do we walk forward in his Spirit, fully surrendered to him? Well, it can start by just showing God's love to those that we come in contact with. God is love, right? And so we can be that hand that's reaching out. We can be the ear that's listening. We can be just a body that is present next to somebody, because God is at work. We can't underestimate how he's going to use us in those moments. And then we can serve those that are in need. God has given us, here at West Springs and just in general, he has given us abundantly more than we have ever could have asked for, right? It's now on us to respond to how are we going to be good stewards of those resources for his glory. And then we have to remain in fellowship with him daily. We have to spend time in the Word. We have to spend time on our knees praying, just being in God's presence. We should become so enamored with who Jesus is that we are willing to get really uncomfortable. And I'm not talking just a little uncomfortable, but really uncomfortable, like I'm squirming in my seat. Uncomfortable. Because irregardless of the consequences, it's going to be worth it for God and his kingdom. We have to be willing to have the conversations with our crowds. That's going to look different for each and every one of us, right? It could be at school for our students. It could be at work. It could be at the grocery store. We don't know where our crowd will show up, but we have to be willing to be the vessel, like the disciples were the vessel for their crowds. We have to be the vessel for our crowds and be willing to be poured out in his name. So as we each consider how to answer the question that Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" and we come to our own personal conclusion, and not our friends, not our spouses, not our parents, but our very own personal response, we need to also reflect on how we've responded to that identity. Has it been appropriate? Are we willing to get uncomfortable because that's obedience to God? Will we be obedient? Because God is at work in each and every one of us here this morning. He's doing things right now to change us, to make us his vessels to go out and share the word. He's doing that as a global from West Springs, right? He is using this church to bring in new families. We see it all the time, and we are so thankful that people are coming in. We go out also and share who Jesus is as well. He's using West Springs. But he's also using our ministries here. And specifically, I can speak to the Wired ministry. He is at work within our group. And that is why we're going on the mission trip that you heard Jeremy talk about. We feel like we are responding to Jesus' identity, even if it means that we're going to get a little uncomfortable, doing some things that we maybe haven't done before. We want to respond because that's who Jesus is to us. So we're going to share Jesus. We're going to share him with people that maybe have never heard of him. Maybe they haven't had the opportunity to hear of him. Or maybe, you know what, they just want to grow closer. And so we're going to help with that down on our mission trip. And so I want to end with this. So as the worship team comes back up, I have a couple things. I know that this church is one that cares and one that serves others. We talked about that. And I know that we're a church that prays. We say that all the time. But will we be a church that responds today to the true identity of Jesus? And then the last thing I want to ask from the congregation is that I want to ask that you be praying for the Wired ministry specifically, especially as they try to come to their own conclusions on whether they are being called to go on this mission trip. We want them to know that they are a part of our family here, they are loved, they are supported, and that they're being prayed for God to use them. So, it's time for y'all to get a little uncomfortable. If you're in the Wired ministry, that means leaders too, please come on up here and stand in front of the stage here. And then I also want to invite the elders up because I want to start that today. I want to start praying for this group now so that way we can come to our own conclusions on how we're going to respond. And then after we conclude with prayer, the worship team will lead us in our final song. And after that, the service will be dismissed. Thank you.